Hello, folks. This week we're going to be talking about Gnostic Christianity, how what we know as Orthodox Christianity responds to Gnosticism and begin to develop standards for what authoritative teaching is. And then look at the beginning of the development of what we call Christology, or a doctrine of Jesus Christ, and Trinitarian theology through the writings of Tertullian. So let's get started with thinking about Gnosticism. One of the things we've come to grapple with is that in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, there really is a wide group of theological opinions and camps, a great deal of diversity. Labels begin to be applied to different groups. And what we're working with here today is labels that the group we would call Catholic or Orthodox begins to apply. Some groups are deemed heresies. This comes from the Greek word heresis, which means something like a party or faction. And that label is applied to groups that another group exists in opposition to. This group that originates the labels calls themselves Catholic, from the word Catholicos, which means universal. So a universal group labeling another group as a faction or party or splinter group. Heresy begins to be used as a label to define what false doctrine is, or also to make the claim that a Christian group is introducing so-called novelties or teachings that aren't authentic to the person and ministry of Jesus Christ and the church. One of the primary bodies of Christianity that this label of heresy gets applied to is Gnosticism. Gnosticism is actually a really complicated category. Part of this is because of the kinds of sources we have. We have essentially 2 ways in which we know about these so-called Gnostic groups. One is polemical sources. That is, sources that are writing in opposition to this group. These are sources that are opposed to heresy and are trying to identify which parties and groups are heretical. So we're reading Irenaeus of Lyon for this week. His text is called Against Heresies. That's a pretty obvious polemical, anti-heretical source from which we learn things about this movement we call Gnosticism. And then there are other primary sources that scholars in the modern era have come to identify as being Gnostic or having Gnostic themes. One of the real difficulties here, though, is we're not even really sure if something called Gnosticism as an easily definable movement existed in the ancient world. Making this observation following the work of Karen King, who's a professor at Harvard Divinity School. Karen King notes that all the definitions of Gnosticism that we have, whether they're from the ancient world, like somebody like Irenaeus of Lyon, or in the modern context, are used to define Orthodox Christianity against this heretical other that's called Gnostic. Now, the word gnosis is really common in Christian sources. It's the Greek word for wisdom. But we don't find the word Gnostic being used in a descriptive way in any of the sources that we have that are labeled Gnostic. So a Gnostic gospel, like the Gospel of Peter, for instance, doesn't use the word Gnostic to define the author or the party in which it's developed. That is, there's no single person we can find in the ancient world who says, I am Gnostic, or this text represents a Gnostic perspective. Rather, other people label certain texts as Gnostic. Furthermore, the term Gnosticism to define a movement isn't used until the modern era. There is no self-described Gnostic movement or Gnostic teachings in the ancient world. So, another way of thinking about this is this term, this identification of a movement, is used by normative Christians, that is, Christians who identify as Catholic or Orthodox, to help define the boundaries of what acceptable Christianity is. It's used as a category to define internal Christian opponents as not being quite the right kind of Christian. And this kind of boundary making also happens with Christianity trying to distinguish itself from paganism and Judaism also, as we saw in the text from Justin Martyr from last week. So if we have all that just in our minds as a way of thinking through this, let's then also ask if we can accept Gnosticism as maybe a description of a broad body of Christians who don't all fit into neat categories. It might still be useful to think about them as parties that were differentiated from what becomes Catholic or Orthodox Christianity. So a couple of things that we can keep in mind here. One is that Gnostic texts are very concerned about the scriptures of Israel, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and they derive a lot of their doctrine from it. In particular, they focus a lot on the book of Genesis. They're very concerned with discerning how this material world has come to be. They experience the material world as an obstacle to spiritual wisdom and salvation. So they often frame that there's this creator God found in Genesis 1 through 3, who's actually a lesser God who's ignorant, malevolent, and harms and persecutes the elect. Another key theme in Gnostic sources is that salvation occurs through acquiring knowledge, and that Jesus Christ gives this knowledge to the elect. Now, this is a theme we saw in the Gospel of Thomas, which is why some people label the Gospel of Thomas as Gnostic. However, others don't. Part of the reason why is because one of the markers of even early Catholic Christianity is talking about salvation as a form of knowing. So an early Christian theologian who's deemed in the Catholic tradition, Clement of Alexandria, stresses how salvation comes via knowledge of Jesus Christ. Yet no one labels Clement as a Gnostic. A third and final key category that I'll talk about today is questions over the nature of Jesus Christ, or who Jesus Christ is. This is the view that this is a position that's often placed upon Gnostics in particular in writings from their opponents. And it's the notion that Jesus Christ, or rather Christ, is a heavenly being whose spiritual essence is joined with this Jesus of Nazareth, this human person. So this is kind of like what we saw with Justin Martyr in the second dialogue, when he's distinguishing between titles, between Christ and Son and Logos over here, and Jesus over here. But even though this is a claim that there is a joining of Christ and Jesus in his human life, Gnostics will say that at the moment of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the spiritual reality of Christ doesn't suffer, that indeed Christ, or the divine quality, leaves the body of Jesus at the moment of crucifixion. This is known as a docetic Christology. I have this in the lecture notes for you. It comes from the Greek word dokeos, which means to seem or to appear. So a docetic Christology says that Jesus Christ, or that which was divine that appeared in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, only seemed to be human or only seemed to be affected by material reality. And so in some ways, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is a deception. Christ was not actually crucified, but only the body of a man. In some traditions, in these so-called Gnostic texts, there's a swapping out of bodies. So the person who was Jesus of Nazareth isn't actually crucified, but another person in his place. There's many variations on this theory. But I think we're getting here to a really important aspect of what distinguishes this branch of Christianity from Catholic Christianity. And it concerns this category, this concept of Doceticism. So I have a little image for you that you can look at on Populi, and might also become available here as well. And we have to remember an ancient cosmology here, that in the Hellenistic concept, there's a strong divide between the material realm and the heavens, or the spiritual realm. So let's imagine the heavens above us, and there can actually be levels or hierarchies of the heavenly or spiritual realm. Below is the material, physical, earthly realm. That's what we exist within. And then there's actually a really firm barrier and distinction between the heavenly and the spiritual. So that in this thinking, the material really can't ever penetrate up to the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm, or the essence of the heavens, can only descend into the earthly realm. And that's the only thing that can also go back up. That is a docetic worldview and docetic understanding of reality. And that's actually quite different than a Catholic Christian understanding of the world based on the incarnation of Jesus Christ. By the time we get to thinking about Tertullian and his Christology in his text Against Praxeas and On the Flesh of Christ that we read for this week, I think you'll be able to see that distinction a little bit more clearly. The other thing to think about then also is how salvation is happening. And I have another diagram for you about how truth is grappled with and considered. This is another image on Populi that you should also be seeing here as well. So in the center of this diagram, I have the category of truth, okay? And then we have categories of the few above and all, or the universal below. And the question is, who discerns truth? And in this docetic Christology, only the elect will be perceiving this reality. And this is a theme throughout Gnostic Christianity, that only the few discern the truth. Whereas in a Catholic ecclesiology, or understanding of salvation or the nature of the church, salvation is available to all people. And so truth can be discerned by all people if simply the gospel is proclaimed openly and clearly. From a Catholic perspective, then, we have Catholicity as a positive valuation, as Catholicity leads to all people being able to seek the truth. If you say the church is for all can have access to it. Their critique of Gnostic Christianity as heresy really rests upon this claim that only the few or the elect can actually perceive the truth. I think this is why there's so much energy against certain Christian groups that claim this special kind of knowledge by writers like Irenaeus of Lyon or Tertullian is that it leaves so many people out of the plan of God's salvation. I hope that diagram here just helps you internalize that and helps you see how these differing ways of being Christian actually have real-world consequences for how churches operate, for how the church relates to the world around it. Okay, I think that's all I have for right now. We'll be back with our next video soon.